Hi, I'm Raphael, a first-year international relations student at King's College London, and this podcast built on my article, After the Blast Before the Future, Lebanon's Christian Communities in Quiet Resurrection. In this piece, I explore what happens long after a war ends, in this case, how Lebanon's Christian communities are quietly rebuilding their lives in state failure. Through memory, art and faith, they are finding ways to heal, not just physically, but also culturally and emotionally. And I didn't choose Lebanon because of my background, as I haven't been there, but because I always have been struck by the country's rich history and culture. And when you learn that Beirut was once known as the Paris of the Middle East, and as a wealthy, peaceful and cosmopolitan city, it is special to see how the last decades unfolded since half a century with the civil war, the invasion, the economic collapse, and finally the massive port explosion in 2020. And Lebanese Christian population, once half the country, now represent just around 30%, as many of them are living. In my French high school last year, there was a student association called Amitié Lebanon, which sent funds to support schools and NGOs in Lebanon, and as I never got involved as much as I wanted to into this association, it sparked my interest on the biggest population and in proportion in the Middle East, but also on their story and their struggles, which are rarely talked into the mainstream media and mainstream discourses. When starting this article, I came across a quote from the current Maronite Church Patriarch, and the Maronite Church is the biggest Christian denomination in the country, saying that hope, prayer and faith were the strength of the Lebanese people and that they have known harder times. And this perfectly outlined the quiet endurance I wanted to mention in my article, being myself a Christian. Hence, to write this piece, I drew on both French and English sources, NGO reports, but also a lot of video testimonies of locals and visits to digital archives like those of the Sursok Museum, which was just recently built. As well, the Reuters war journalism course I did through this internship also shaped how I approach these testimonies, because I learned how to report on trauma, which was essential in this piece, because I mentioned not just what people said, but also what they couldn't say because of the taboo and the erasure of communal memory. Also, what surprised me most was how Lebanon's civil war wasn't officially taught in school, but that somehow every generation carries it, and it is understood in the street, but also in the way when you talk with locals, the one I met and one I read testimonies about. And this aligned with a collective spirit of amnesia and the erasure of culture. And for instance, a recent project called Beirut was meant to be a memory museum, but instead it has been replaced as a corporate event space for rich people to have parties in the capital. And when I learned that, I felt concerned that sites filled with memory and history were wiped away for profit. And this is partly how I realized that memory was a battleground, which is a dynamic that not just concerns Lebanon but a lot of theaters worldwide. When reading about this article, there's a term from the historian Marwan Shanin that I found powerful, as he calls Lebanese communities intimate stranger, which are for him people who live side by side, but after decades of sectarian division, they don't know each other anymore. And this is especially true for many Christian families, where grief and trauma are passed down generation, often without words or conversation about the civil war. And I think that's also why I was drawn to this topic, because of the question of memory, how we either remember conflict or choose to forget it. And this was familiar to me because this is a topic I similarly approached before in my studies, but also because in the case of Lebanon, France is often implicated in the matter through the subsequent diaspora we have in the country and through France's historical role in the region. So in Lebanon, memory is not just something people reflect on, but also something they navigate every day. And this struggle with memory doesn't exist in isolation, but is more, I would say, the result of a deeper ongoing collapse that was exemplified by the tragedy of the Beirut port blast in 2020, but also in their daily lives with current and constant blackouts and skyrocketing prices. For instance, Christian and schools and churches are barely staying open, and we also witness a psychological collapse among Gen Z, which is a subject which has a special importance for me, as being part of the same generation. And in Lebanon, the Lebanese youth experience an inherited trauma from a past they didn't live through. And in 2025, as I speak, 70 to 80% of young Christians say they want to leave the country, and surprisingly, more Lebanese are currently living outside the country than inside. This is why the diaspora became a lifeline for the remaining, as they are sending aid, rebuilding church for the community, but also a wound, because it creates a constant feeling of being split with their own brothers and being reliant of abroad communities to survive. And yet, in Lebanon, people are quietly rebuilding. They are not waiting for the state to save them, but are doing it in their communities locally through faith, food, murals, but also through the transmission of memory. And we have NGOs and organizations like Caritas that offer healthcare, education, and trauma support. And while their work is grounded in Christian values, their aid and their assistance is open to all. And they don't just provide charity, but I would say that they restore dignity to the population. And we can see a similar framework in Tripoli, where women are learning to grow crops through hydroponic farming with minimal water. And this project is not just about growing food, but also about regaining a sense of control over their lives and about what they do to be independent and to live in a better country, even with the hardship that happened the last decade. And then there is art that plays a great role in influencing the country's memory and transmission, fighting the erasure of the civil war. And my favorite example is the Surfsog Museum, which was destroyed by the port blast a few years ago, but just has been restored. And one artist within created an installation there using the sound of breaking glasses, which is also the sound of the port explosion, over projected artworks. And this displays how the communities try, even with recent traumatism, to overcome them and to advance throughout their communities and to advance for a better Lebanon. These numerous artists are rebuilding a new kind of memories, not one that divides but one that connects, that embodies resistance among the population. And when I created the side infographic that goes alongside my article, and I mapped actors, it reminded me that this wasn't a scattered effort to improve the quality of life of the population, but really a network and a cultural ecosystem in which NGOs, artists, and communities get together for a better future. Finally, what surprised me most was the quietness of the project, with no rage or uprising or even protest the last years, but steady and persistent work by the population. And my article is not about Lebanon's tragedy, but about the refusal of just being a tragedy. And when I mention, for instance, murals painted on broken walls and resurrection, not as a metaphor, but as a lived form of survival, I draw on the human needs to really explain how the population overcome the struggles and tend to build something better for the generation to come and for my generation, the Gen Z. In the media, we often focus on how war begins, but it is as important to ask what happened 10, 20, 50 years even down the road, and when the media moves on, but the people remain and are still living, still rebuilding in the same places where trauma happened. I would say this is what cultural action is about, not just resisting injustice, but reclaiming life and shared space through prayer, performance, and perseverance. On a more personal note, these projects and the week of research behind it reminded me that I care about human rights and also why journalism matter in this instance. Because I would say that some stories aren't just worth telling, but they are worth remembering. And we also learn a lot about our own societies by looking about how courageous people like the Lebanese Christian community survive and thrive in a destroyed and wounded nation.